Hello and welcome to The View from Felaban. I'm talking to David Schwartz, the President and CEO of Fiba, the Florida International Bankers Association. Welcome, David. And obviously Fiba is helping organize the Felaban's annual assembly when it is in Miami, so you're very much part of the organization and the event here. And what I wanted to ask you is about the relations between your constituents and North American banks in general, and their Latin American counterparts when it comes to issues around regulation, but also when it comes to the broader issues that have to do with international trade agreements, Nafta obviously being the prime example.
Right.
Where to start? Shall we start from Nafta?
Okay, let's start with the last one first.
Yeah.
I get a lot of questions about Nafta because, of course, Nafta, we're talking about trade and trade relations for North America, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So people are very concerned. Mexico is a very large and important trading partner. We share the border. And people are concerned, what will happen if the U.S. withdraws from Nafta? And what I tell them is, let's relax. Nothing has happened yet. And we're talking about an agreement that is quite old by agreement standards. And just like any old agreement, sometimes you need to pick it up and dust it off and look at it and maybe bring it into the modern era.
So that's all good. The concern that people have is whether there isn't going to be no agreement.
Correct. And that would be problematic because we already have the issues around correspondent banking and the relationships between the North American banks and Latin America as a region. And if NAFTA were to disappear, what would that impact be? Well, if you no longer have the free flow and the volume of trade that you have, that means banks will not be financing trade to the volumes that they were previously. And this will have an impact, negative impact obviously, on the region, because there the concern is importers, exporters. How are they going to get financing? If they cannot get financing, what does this mean for their business? What does it mean for their country if they can no longer import the goods that they wanted at the prices that they used to have? And of course, the impact at the end on financial inclusion, which is always a big problem for the region, that if you don't have this free flow of financing, how do you keep everybody into the financial system?
So that's one of the big concerns, I would imagine, for the banks that you represent.
Absolutely. I mean, that will be one of the unintended consequences because really, as I said, everybody's looking at trade, just trade between two countries, and not looking deep behind that and what does that mean for the banking systems.
So another big concern continues to be regulation, right? And most people were expecting the wave of heavy regulation to subside with the Trump presidency. Indeed, President Trump did suggest that that would happen, but we haven't really seen much of it.
It's going along behind the scenes right now. The president did sign 2 executive orders. One executive order said for any new regulation that you want to enact, you have to withdraw 2. So that's very challenging for the government. The second one was, in order to enact that, let's take a review of the regulations. As I was saying with NAFTA, our Bank Secrecy Act is almost 50 years old. Now, it needs to be updated, it needs to be modernized. We received a request in June from both the Treasury Department and the federal functional regulators for comments regarding the FFIEC manual, which is the governing manual for examinations on banks in the United States. And for Treasury, it was a review of all of their forms, rules, and regulations. And remember, Treasury encompasses FinCEN, OFAC, the IRS, so you have many agencies underneath there. And so it was a very large undertaking. We're still waiting, obviously, to hear the results of the review and if there will be any changes.
It's a big body of rules and a number of organizations involved. Now, if regulation became a little bit softer on the North American banks, what would that mean? I know it's difficult to make any kind of focus because we don't know how that new body of regulation would look like, but do you have any sense of how that might affect the relation with the Latin American counterparts?
Well, there's I don't want to call it a myth, shall we say, around this de-risking or debanking or decosting, in that it was purely related to regulation, and that's not true. Banks started to take a look. It started off with risk, because you were balancing the compliance risk with the reward. But then as they delved deeper, they started to look at that risk versus reward and said, okay, what are the volumes that are coming through these accounts? Is it really worth us maintaining this account? Does it generate enough activity and enough revenue? Because of course revenue is important. Shareholders want revenue, the board wants revenue. So is it generating enough revenue to justify the risk that we're taking and the cost of compliance? So the first wave was really de-costing, was getting rid of those relationships that weren't revenue generating. So yes, compliance was an important factor. However, that doesn't mean that if we have a relaxation of regulation, that banks are going to rush back in to correspondent banking. Part of the concern is still, and this is the regulation that won't be rolled back, is the issue of fraud and corruption in the region. And corruption, as we've seen with a lot of very high-profile cases, has really become significant to the U.S. regulators. We're seeing OFAC enforcing regulation in foreign countries. We have the two cases of Central America. We have Honduras and Panama, where OFAC actually went in, sanctioned not just a bank, but economic groups in those two countries, which impacted employment, and yet the governments themselves had not taken any steps towards those two groups. And OFAC has no intention of backing off. So this is still a great concern. How do you control that inside a bank? All this movement of corrupt money. We of course had, and I call it Mossack and Fonseca. Now we have the Paradise Papers, which is really nothing significant after Mossack and Fonseca. But that just opened everybody's eyes to the type of corruption that was out there. And FinCEN issued geographic targeting orders here in the United States for real estate, because that's where a lot of the corrupt money was going into.
So there are issues that are particular of the region that go way beyond rules imposed on U.S. banks that may deter those U.S. banks to continue doing business.
Yes, because what happened, the concerns were about compliance. I remember 10 years ago that in the institution I was working in, I was in charge of international risk management, and I had implemented procedures which said we needed to review the anti-money laundering program of the correspondent bank we were working with. And if we found it lacking, we would request them to make changes and have board approval. What we found was many of these banks had programs that looked exactly the same. So it was almost as if they had hired the same consultant to help them build their program. But what about implementation? How effective were those programs? That's what we're seeing today at the government level. That's the concern of the US government, is that the regional governments are not effectively implementing their policy, their program for anti-money laundering in their country. So do we see any high profile or even low profile enforcement actions in the region brought by the local governments? We haven't. So that's why I mentioned OFAC.
That's what really needs to happen in 2018 for things to change faster.
We need to see effective implementation. This year at our anti-money laundering conference, we had a dialogue with, to my right, the US regulators, and to my left, the Latin American regulators. And to a person, the US regulators said, we don't have any gaps in terms of regulation. They have all the regulations. What we're seeing is a lack of effective implementation. And that was the voice of the US government speaking. So that's the change that needs to happen. We're seeing it slowly in some countries, but there's still things like information sharing, even between law enforcement and regulators, that don't exist in these countries. And that's problematic.
Thank you for your comments, David.
My pleasure, Silvia.